Hey everyone, this is Catalin, and in today's interview I have John Vervaeke. John is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in the psychology department. He's currently teaching courses in cognitive science, psychology, Buddhism, psychology, mental health, including topics such as mindfulness, psychology as wisdom, cultivating consciousness, meaning, and many others. His new video series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, is an in-depth series with the goal to present an overall unified argument and showcase how can they develop more meaning in their lives in today's society. So John, thank you so much for taking the time this Saturday to sit down with me.
Thank you, Catalin.
And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So
Me too.
why don't we start with giving just a short background and a little bit of a story of who you are and kind of your work and what you do, and then we'll go into some specific specific things.
So, as you mentioned, I'm a assistant professor at the University of Toronto, the teaching stream in cognitive psychology and cognitive science. I got into that because I went into university and I'd already been sort of introduced to issues around meaning from literature. I'd been reading some Hermann Hesse and had read some Jung, and then I read Plato, and this whole topic of wisdom became really pressing to me. But as I went on further in academic philosophy, that sort of fell by the wayside. Now I found that what academic philosophy was teaching me about sort of meta-science and metacultural critique, I thought, and the skills of of conceptual analysis and theoretical argumentation, I found that all valuable, so I continued. But my appetite for this topic of wisdom and self-transcendence and leading a good life, and the model of Socrates was, and still remains, just personally very valuable to me, was still leaving this lasting, resonant impression on me. So I took up some practices from more Eastern traditions, from Taoism, Tai Chi, Qigong, Fijin, things like that, and then from Buddhism, a form of meditation, a form of contemplation, Vipassana, and Metta. And I started cultivating that. And as I progressed along that, the culture sort of turned in some ways, and the academic world turned, and people started talking about these topics of mindfulness and wisdom and self-transcendence and enlightenment, altered states of consciousness, all of this. And I was one of the first people to start teaching about mindfulness and related topics, wisdom at the University of Toronto, Michel Ferrari as well. And so I started to notice that there was this growing confluence, at least in my own life, between my personal pursuit of meaning, for lack of a better word, and the academic investigation of it and its attendant concepts. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And I started, like I say, integrating it more. And then that integration was starting to be particularly resonant with my students. And it was like really drawing people in. And so I started to examine more and look more broadly and started to more and more reflect on, and I've been reading people like Charles Taylor and many other people, and this idea of a meaning crisis. I started to present preliminary versions of the argument. So while I was developing the argument around the meaning crisis, I was still continuing to do my scientific work on the nature of intelligence, the nature of insight problem solving, the nature of cognitive development, the nature of consciousness, and functionality of consciousness. And so more and more I wanted to integrate this all together, because that's what I am by nature, a person who tries to build an integrated big picture. And I started to lay out a more and more complex argument that had sort of two sides to it, a historical analysis of the genealogy of the meaning crisis, and I was greatly helped by the work I did on the book with Christopher Mastropietro and Philip Miscevic. And then also developing a scientific analysis of all the meaning-making machinery, issues around self-transcendence and wisdom. And then I started doing conferences, talks, I started filming my lectures, and I was getting interest. But then I had a student in particular who came to me and said, like, you've got to up the production quality on this. And he volunteered his time, and then he was, by that time, his former student, and and then he volunteered his time, and some of his friends, and his dad is a professional editor. And then as soon as I started doing that, more and more people came in and just they kept sort of committing time and effort because they really believed in the project and what I was doing. And so it's just sort of gathered steam from there.
Yeah, so when we're talking about and let's start there. Let's just give people, well, everybody knows what meaning is, right? Even though they haven't went to formal training, it's funny that we do all know what meaning is and what it feels like. We've all had some, well, hopefully, I'm not sure about that, some taste of it in our lives. So how would you define, and let's start from there, and then we'll go to wisdom and insight and other things. How would you define a meaning, and what do you think is this meaning crisis that's going on right now in today's society?
So I think the term meaning is being used as a metaphor. And it's a metaphor designed, as you said, to express this intuitive sense we have, and the fact that we pursue something. Well, of course, we are also very capable of pursuing things without having a clear understanding of what it is we're pursuing. That's the source of a lot of human tragedy in a lot of ways. But anyways, what people are saying is there's something about the quality of the organization of their life and how they're living it that's analogous to how a sentence coheres together, and then how that sentence is significant to them, has an impact on their fundamental understanding of themselves and the world, right? And then how that sentence could also be used to make their thoughts, relevant to other people, connected to other people, enabled to clarify their thinking to other people. So I would say if we look at it, and this is some of the research, and I'm doing this with Jensen Kim and Talia Franzidis and Philip Vervaeke we're working right now on a paper trying to integrate all the psychological accounts of what's meant by meaning in life. We're going to be presenting it at APA this year and then trying to get it published. So I want to make it clear that I'm also speaking on their behalf, but I'll be adding elements of my own thought as well. So what the research seems to be pointing is what people mean when they're talking about meaning in life is a sense of coherence, that there is a comprehensive intelligibility to their life in some important way. So there's definitely this cognitive, and that can be enhanced by experiences of sort of insight or a sense of, getting a more deeper illumination about the underlying intelligibility of things. Then, of course, I think part of it is that, it makes an impact, it's significant to you. I think part of what people mean by meaning in life is kind of an internal version of this coherence, that the way they're living their life is reducing inner conflict and giving them a fullness of being, where all the different parts of the psyche are cohering in such a way that each one is getting sort of as much life as it can without trespassing on the life of other components of the psyche. So reason and emotion and motivation and imagine, all of these things are at peace with each other. And I don't mean just in the lack of conflict, I mean in this sense of there's kind of an optimization of fullness of being. And then the next part of that is a sense of connectedness. I think fundamentally people want to feel that they have connections to other human beings. We know that contributes significantly to meaning in life. And then I think above all of this sense of intelligibility, this sense of, for lack of a better word, inner peace, and this sense of being connected to other people and to the environment, being connected to the natural world, to the cultural world matters. I think above all of that is sort of a meta component, which is that this is all real, that it's not being generated by delusion, and that all of this is really actually helping people to overcome, the foolishness, the self-deception in their own lives, and to self-transcend into a wiser way of being. I think that's what people are talking about when they're talking about meaning.
So it's interesting you say that is real, because nobody, and from my account and researching and the limited study I've done, nobody seems to question that it's real. They know it.
Right.
So there's something inherently in us that knows what's meaning when we see it and knows it's real when we see it, so that we can re-engineer our lives around that. And we don't need somebody to tell us when that is.
Well, we do and we don't. I mean, okay. So what I would say is there's two different issues here. There's the issue of whether or not we feel that the meaning is real, and that's also separate from the issue of whether or not the factors that are generating the meaning are real. So we've all had the experience where we think somebody cares for us a certain way, we attribute a lot of meaning, and then we realize, oh, that's not true. Right? And so the experience of meaning is real, but what we're attributing the meaning to, that might not match. So people want it to be a match, right? They want that the meaning system they have is, really nicely, sewn in to the fabric of reality, if you'll allow me to speak metaphorically. The other thing I want to say about the realness is I think that there's deep connections. So this comes, I think, out of the Platonic tradition, and Eric Pearl, I think, has done some of the best work on this, but many people have. I think there's deep connections between our sense of intelligibility and our sense of realness. The sense that things hang together in a mutually intelligible fashion is one of the primary ways in which we judge things to be real. And so I think that means there are deep connections between finding things meaningful and feeling that we're in touch with reality.
So what I wanted to, so thank you for pointing that out. What I wanted to mention with this is, and what I want to go is, so we have this aspect of realness, and where we go from there is there's, well, maybe two sides or more sides to the argument, but there's some people that don't really believe in meaning as a whole, and they say it doesn't exist and whatever. But on the other side, and this is kind of my personal hypothesis, what I've observed is there's all these things that we have in our society. We have drugs, video games, we have sex, we have all the other things. And it seems like when you don't have meaning, let's assume, in my visual idea, it would be like kind of like a bucket, and meaning would be water that's pouring into it. Only a waterfall that big or infinite, meaning, only that type of water will be able to fill this bucket at all times. And what happens is, if people don't have that, they try to fill it with all these other things, but it's so short term and it goes off. You do something and then next morning you need to start again, and it's like a continual process. With meaning, it seems like it's sustainable. That's how I see it. What do you think about that? And what do you think about how that relates to what people are going through, like things like addiction,
sure,
like depression, all these other things? Feels like they're trying to fill their bucket with the wrong things, when in reality they need to find something real like this.
So I think that's a very important point. I think there's different ways in which we can talk about the symptoms of the meaning crisis. Some ways in which it expresses itself in the seeking behavior of people, some ways in which it expresses itself in the self-destructive behavior of people, or the self-deceptive. So we can talk about it in different ways. I do think it's correct to say that if people are not getting... There's quite a bit of work coming out right now on the idea of a scarcity mentality. When people feel that something that is valuable to them is scarce, food, resources, then what starts to happen is their behavior tends to become very short-term, much more impulsive, loses a lot of insight and flexibility, becomes much more sort of self-deceptive, irrational. These are a lot of the points. And so I think what you're putting your finger on is, I think people are reacting to a meaning scarcity. And so what they do is they start to act in impulsive, short-term, I think that was your way of putting it, and often sort of self-destructive or at least self-deceptive fashion. So I think one way of interpreting a lot of that is exactly to say people are demonstrating a scarcity mentality, and it seems to be a scarcity of meaning in their lives in an important way. So we know that people will make distinctions between things like subjective well-being, just how sort of well they're feeling with their lives, pleasure, and those aren't necessarily the same thing, and meaning. So those three are actually distinguishable between from each other, and that people will often sacrifice pleasure, and they will sacrifice subjective well-being in order to increase meaning in life. So there's evidence for that. And so I think a way of putting that all together coherently is to say, yes, if people are not getting sets of practices that are legitimated by institutions and cultural communities and a collective worldview. Their meaning-making projects will become autodidactic, tend to be fragmented, and that will put them into something like a meaning scarcity, and then they will start to respond in this way. And I think the work of a lot of people, let's take your example of addiction. So I mentioned this in the video series. My friend and colleague Mark Lewis has a model of addiction that I think comports very well with some of the stuff I talk about in the meaning series. One of the things I talk about that's the sort of core of the meaning making is this relationship between our sense of agency and that the world is an arena for action, this agent-arena relationship. Well, Mark has a similar model of how addiction actually works. It's not so much that you get sort of just a raw biological craving for the drug. It's more like this. The drug sort of it causes changes in your state of consciousness, and that maybe impairs your cognition a bit. And what that means is you lose some of your cognitive flexibility, and then some of your options in the world go down. And the world narrows a bit. And then as the world narrows a bit, your agency narrows. And then as your agency, you see what happens? You get this reciprocal narrowing until you feel there's no options in the world and there's no options in yourself. And that's what it is to be addicted. It's sort of a spiraling loss of all of that stuff we've been talking about. That agency, that sense of connectedness, right? Right? And everything, so what you're seeing is meanings just sort of being drained away in this downward spiral. I pointed out to Mark, and he said he thought this was a good thing to say, that if it spirals down like this, that actually points that we have the opposite possibility for us, that we could do and then Plato talked very much about this, that we could expand back out. Now, what's missing for a lot of people is, okay, but what do I do to do this? What do I do to open up myself and the world in this connected fashion?
Okay, so well, let's go there. What do people do? And one thing that I want to point out, and let me know what your thoughts on this, is it seems like the world has been built on the first couple of levels of the Maslows hierarchy of get people safety, get people food, get people shelter, but not that much above that. And only recently, it seems to me like economically, we even had a chance, like we even could have the possibility to seek the things we love, to do the things we want to do, to have an option of not going to the army. Like, I don't think this was an option in 1729. It maybe was, I'm not quite sure, because there were a lot of great people in all times of history. But it seems like all society was built around giving people the safety nets of the hierarchy of needs, and now all of a sudden, and now because we have those set, we feel this desire for meaning, and now that becomes a huge problem because we are especially American people and Canadian people and the Western society like France and UK, they're not going to starve to death. That's not going to happen. It's very unlikely. It could happen, but it's very unlikely. So now this becomes a problem, and what people tend to do, I think, is all that society has told me that I should do, I've done, and I don't feel fulfilled. So what do you think about that, and what do you think should be some things that young people or what the young people could take to actually start progressing in a more meaningful life rather than progressing in towards a less meaningful life?
Sure, excellent points. So on the first point, I agree with the core idea, sort of Maslow, which I think he ultimately gets from Aristotle.
Yeah.
The idea that, don't talk to somebody about meaning if they're starving. Don't talk to somebody about meaning if they don't have shelter. And I hope nobody misinterprets me as doing that.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that at all. However, I do think these issues of meaning are more important than that might convey. So I would point to the fact that an important, whatever criticisms we have of it from a scientific worldview, but nevertheless, religion has been pervasive. And one of the projects, I take it, of wisdom, and this is in fact how many people are still defending defending religion, I meant religion, against the scientific worldview, or they talk about how, religion is a place where people are cultivating meaning. And religion has been pervasive. In fact, there are people who have argued, and I think they've done excellent work, David Lewis Williams, Matt Rosano, Michael Winkelmann, that if you look back to the Upper Paleolithic transition, where you see the emergence of of individuals that are recognizably becoming like us, right? And you see the emergence of something that looks like religion at the same time as you're getting the sophisticated, right, projectile weapons and the calendars. You're also getting clear ceremonial burial, you're getting music, you're getting cave art, and these are, deep underground. People are going through deep transformative experiences just to access these caves. So I think that even in the, harshest survival situations, human beings have deeply sought meaning, and that meaning has been integrated with enhancing their cognition for survival, and also often, I think, with altering their state of consciousness, again in ways that they found translated into improving their ability to interact with their environment. So I wouldn't put it as starkly as these. Maslow doesn't quite have the hierarchy of needs. That's kind of a textbook model of Maslow, and so I think that in one sense you're right. We shouldn't think of people. We shouldn't be coming up to people and say, why aren't you pursuing meaning when they're starving or when they're sick, or like, of course not. Poverty has to be addressed. But what I'm trying to say is I don't think meaning arises for human beings just when all the lower needs are met. I think it's woven into the fabric of our cognitive agency from the very, very beginning.
I think I just want to clarify on this, then we'll go on how people can actually develop this. Is I've seen, especially from talking to people, that there's this moral feeling that people have that somehow, even if they don't have their life straight and they don't have a job and they might have a family and they're not taking care of it, somehow they justify not doing those things for pursuing something. There's something like a insecurity hidden in a virtue, something like that.
Yeah.
So it's not like you're going. There's not a series of steps that you need to go. You need to go to 2 in order to go to 3. You can have meaning, maybe not maximum amount of meaning when you're pursuing also shelter and all these other things. You don't have to take them one by one. That's what I want to bring out, because people tend to be like, I'll take care of that later.
Yes, exactly.
Or
that was my point.
They do that 100% without taking care of their health. I mean, there's I don't know why that happens. I guess that's too complicated, but would you agree with that? Would you say that's accurate?
I think that's right. I think that people shift around in emphasis. I think there's a potential for being irresponsible or abusing the pursuit of meaning to the detriment of other things that need to be addressed. I don't deny any of that. I don't think that meaning in that sense is the unquestionable trump card over everything else that's important to human beings. My point was, and I think you're acknowledging it, that we shouldn't think of meaning as sort of the icing on the cake after everything is taken care of. I think meaning is woven into our humanity in a profound and pervasive way.
Okay, so how can people, so let's say I'm 16 right now, which would be, I would think, a good time because you're kind of mature enough and you kind of you can make some decisions. What would be your advice or your strategy or your thought process to start developing a life in which you develop the sense of meaning more so than other things?
Right. So I think the thing to put an emphasis on is to put emphasis on transforming your practices as opposed to just transforming your beliefs. All culture puts a lot of emphasis on changing people's beliefs. Not because that's irrelevant, I don't say that, but I think it's insufficient. I think most of the meaning-making machinery is not taking place at the level of sort of propositional knowledge. I think it's taking place at procedural, perspectival, participatory knowing. And so you need practices. And I would recommend thinking about cultivating an ecology of practices, trying to find practices that have well-established traditions behind them, and if possible, any relevant scientific research attached to them that gives you a clear understanding of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the practices, and then set them together into an overall system so the strengths and weaknesses, right, are in trade-off relationships. They compensate and balance for each other. And so I think you should engage in mindfulness practices and develop a lot of important attentional skills. You should do both meditative practices in which you're looking inward, contemplative practices in which you're looking outward. I think you should do a lot of movement practices. There's clear, and this is something that needs to be emphasized, the role of the way the brain is embodied in a sensory, motor, living, interaction with the world is very important. So movement practices are very important, like martial art.
Like dancing, martial arts.
Dancing, martial art. I think you want to engage in practices, and this is, fortunately for this, there's quite a bit of really good scientific research around this. You want to engage in practices in improving your inference, like your inference machinery, how you use inference to alter your belief. Because again,
so what does that mean?
What does that mean? So that means paying attention to all of the very good cognitive psychology by people like Stanovich and others, saying, what you need to do is look for ways in which the cognitive biases that are built into human intelligence, that are adaptive, nevertheless can be misapplied and thwart when you're thinking or reflecting or reasoning about things, and thereby undermine your goal of trying to get the truest beliefs you can. And so what you want to do is you want to learn about those biases. Here's one, confirmation bias. I only look for evidence that confirms my chosen beliefs, the beliefs I like, right? There's many of these. You have to learn to look for these biases and then learn to try to actively counteract them in your life. So I would recommend the pursuit of active open-mindedness is what it's called. But of course, as I mentioned, your attentional processes can also be a source of self-deception. So you need mindfulness for that. All right, understanding, right, the way in which your body, and I mean your lived body, is fitting you to the world can also be a potential source of self-deception. That you need to bring expertise, reflective expertise. I don't mean just theory. I mean you keep practicing until you get those insights. It's, yes, right. When I'm this way in my body, for example, I tend towards this pattern of behavior, things like that. You also want to practice training your perspectival knowing.
So what does that mean?
So your perspectival, so I have a perspective right now, right? So things are salient to me. You're standing out to me, more stuff, and you're foregrounded, stuff is backgrounded, right? And it's constantly flowing. And within that salience network, or salience landscape, as I like to call it, getting the term originally from Ramachandran, right? There's a pattern of obviation. Things are made obvious to me. Like I should look at your face. I shouldn't be looking here, right? That's obvious, right? But obviousness is not part of the physics. The salience landscape and the obvious. But the thing is, we also know that what we find salient and what we find obvious can be used to manipulate us. We can use it to deceive ourselves because, right, we can judge the wrong things as obvious. We can find the wrong things salient, right? So we need to practice paying attention to how we generate our perspectives. Part of that is our mindfulness practice, but part of it is also practicing taking other people's perspectives, and especially taking on the perspectives of people we deem to be more rational, to be more wise. This is how you came to have the cognitive maturity you have. You've internalized the perspectives of
other people,
and often older, mature people. And so choosing as best you can, I mean, it's a bootstrapping problem, and there's always the possibility of error in there, and there's no way of escaping that, okay? But choosing as best you can, what you want to do is choose individuals who have for whom you have good reason to believe they demonstrate a rationality of attention or inference or action.
The outcomes that you're looking for.
Well, the outcomes, but also that the outcomes are systematic in their lives.
So they're not just chance or flukes. Okay.
And then you make it a practice of trying to reverse engineer for yourself what it would be like to see the world the way they did, such that they could act the way they do. And so I take certain people and I try to reverse engineer sets of practices that will bring about transformations of consciousness and cognition that will, I think, allow me to at least plausibly live like, for example, or see or behave. And I don't mean this, I hope this is not understood arrogantly, but the way Socrates did or something like that. And then try to practice that until it starts to become second nature, becomes part of my metacognitive machinery. And then also participatory knowing. I need to put myself in places, ritual context, that's the best word for it, where real significant transformation is possible for me. I think that has to be chosen extremely carefully.
Like what?
So, I mean, one way that people, of course, are turning to more and more, and then it interacts with others, is people get, I was just talking about this in some of the videos here, people get very stuck in their life. And I don't mean settled, because that's one thing. I mean, they feel like, I want to be that person over there, and I want to be living in that world, but I can't get there, and I don't know how.
They don't see any path to get there.
They don't see any path, and also they're very indecisive because they don't know who they're going to be when they get there, and they don't know what they're going to lose. And and I talk about how L.A. Paul talks about that a lot. And so people enter into therapy. Therapy is a ritual context. Right? I mean, what you have in therapy is enacted symbols, and you play with metaphor, you play with analogy, you play with, internalizing the therapist's
and
point of view.
you try to find solutions.
Right. But the finding isn't the finding that you're doing normally just on your own. I mean, the work of Igor Grossman and others going back to the Berlin paradigm shows, I think, at least provides some very good evidence that, we're generally better if we can get a third-person perspective. Even practicing taking a third-person perspective
because
on your
you're so full of your biases,
Yes.
it would just be it would be too hard for you to see.
You're familiar with this, right? So you see your friend doing the same stupid thing, right, in their romantic life that they've done before, and you're trying to tell them, and you seem so wise, but yet when it comes to your life, you realize, oh, I've repeated these mistakes again. It's so what, right? But practicing, and that's what the Platonic dialogues are so good. Practicing getting out that third-person perspective, that even a second-person perspective, right?
So there's some sort of a, let's say this is you, so you're going this way, then you're going this way, so you're trying to go
You're playing.
You're going all around yourself to try to make yourself better, something like that.
You're playing with that agent-arena relationship in a space where you can sort of feel who you are and what the world is like to you now, but also who you could be and what the world could be. And if the person has the requisite skill to manage that transformational ritual context, then you can get the participatory knowing. You and the agent arena relationship can be reconfigured so that they are more fluently coupled and in conformity with each other.
Okay, so we have practices such as meditation, such as looking inward, looking outwards.
Yeah.
We need to find ways to get perspectives from other people that we have the most reasons to believe that they have the outcomes in a systematic way that we're looking for, which is quality of life, meaning, certain type of reasoning, and so on.
Ability to overcome self-deception, ability to provide sage advice,
so that's
clear insight. Yep.
So you do that by reading books, you do that by getting mentors, by speaking to people.
Yes, yep. Don't forget, you want to improve, as I said, the active open-mindedness to training your inference, your ability to reason. Okay. That's also vitally important.
Okay, and then participatory rituals.
Yeah.
So like things like therapy,
you might
group
want
debate.
Yes, I mean, there's group discussions. There's lots of communities. One of the gifts of the video series is I've been put in touch with so many communities of people who are creating, and I mean this in a complementary fashion, ritual contexts of transformation. So I talk a lot, for example, with Rafe Kelly. I did one interview with him. I've talked with him a bit. I'm going to do another with him on, I think, next Monday. and he belongs to a parkour community where they're using movement and practices, interaction with the world, but also discussion and reflection to try and bring about a transformation in participatory knowing for people.
So all these group activities, they're all kind of like that. Okay, so we have these things. Okay, so I'm
And like I said, you want them systematically in an ecology together. You don't want just autodidactic, ad hoc. Oh, this I like. You want, okay, this has got this weakness, but this complements it. This. Let's put it together in an overall intelligible, mutually reinforcing, self-organizing system.
Okay, so let's say you're creating routines of yourself in your week, month, week or month, let's say, and day, in which you constantly add these things. So you meditate once a day or 2 times a day, whatever that practice might be that you're doing, mindfulness, vipassana, or some other one. There's a lot of practices out there.
Sure.
Okay, so now, let's say I'm starting to put that together. Now, my next challenge is...
You're not going to be doing that on your own, though, right? You're going to be discussing with other people,
reasoning
with other people, doing the ritual practices, etc. Okay, just wanted to be clear about that.
So, because if I'm doing a participatory activity in a group, it implies that I'm doing it together with other people. I think, sure.
That's important to me because one of my criticisms is we tend to have a culture that is driving people, and I think that's the correct way of putting it, into an autodidactic spirituality. And autodidactism is a very powerful way to get into a self-deceptive spiral. So that's why I just wanted to intervene.
Because there's no feedback loop outside of yourself, so you could be wrong.
And the problem with a lot of social media, the internet, is people think they're getting feedback, but all they do is echo chamber. Okay,
it's confirmation bias at scale.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's exactly. Sorry for interrupting, but I wanted to make that clear.
Okay, so we got those things in place. Now, next thing is, what about my finance? What about my health? Let's say that's connected. What about my relationship? But let's just stick with, I think the biggest concern that people have is, but how I'm gonna pay for university? How I'm gonna, what job should I take? What, all these things. So the points of, I think you talked about, and I found this idea interesting. There was this book by a woman, Susan Wolf,
yes,
I think that's her name.
Meaning in Life and What Matters.
Yeah,
and
she said, you mentioned the point from her book, which was, morality is not enough. Well, okay, so that's very interesting. So people, most of the times, when they're looking at financial success, people want to have some sort of activity, some sort of mastery that they're doing, some sort of...
I think the 3 M's are important: morality, mastery, and meaning.
Okay, so let's talk about those. So we have the practices in place, and we're doing all these things. These are kind of meta skills, or I don't know what that is. But now, what about my actual job? What about the actual, let's say with a job, because that's mostly what people are worried about. How should I pick that? How should I know if I'm not in the right direction? Most people do what their parents tell them to do, unfortunately. Well, that's for many reasons probably. But what do you think in regards to that? So let's say I'm doing progress.
You're asking a very good question, and I don't want to give a trivial answer, so it'll sound sort of trite. But the point I would say, and hopefully we can expand on it, is, look, I mean, what do you want to bring to bear on your decisions other than wisdom? I mean, that's the thing you want to always be cultivating. And what of the goals, I'm not saying, and I've said from the beginning, not the exclusive goal, I'm admitting, a moral life, a life of which you have mastery over, your environment in a way in which your other needs are being met, right? But, so not only do you want wisdom when you're trying to cultivate morality and mastery, but you also want wisdom for a goal you also want, which is, and we've talked about it from the beginning, meaning in life. So I think what I would say to people is, but if you develop the skills and the sensibilities that we're talking about here, surely that would increase the probability, not the certainty, but the probability that you're going to make better choices, and that you're also going to zero in more accurately on the goals that usually predict happier lives. Human beings are not I don't want to deny what you said about the intuitive sense of the normativity of meaning, but human beings are actually not that good at judging What's going to make them happy or what's going to make them sad. They're very poor at what's called effective forecasting, actually.
Yeah.
People say, oh, here's a classic example. Once I win the lottery, man, 6 weeks or a month, 2 months after they win the lottery, it's like, oh,
Same with tragic events.
Yeah, same
right?
with tragic events too. And so you have to be really careful. And people don't realize, right, that our culture tends to overemphasize, wealth at the expense of personal relationships. And their impact on happiness is, or maybe happiness broadly construed to touch on all of these domains, not just subjective well-being, right? I'm using it in the Greek sense of happiness. But, relationships, stable, meaningful relationships that touch on all of those aspects, that we get, true beliefs, we get powerful skills, we get perspectives that make us feel really immersed and present with people, and we get participatory transformation of those people.
Yeah.
Love in that sense. Those contribute fantastically, way more. Well, once you're out of poverty, and again, not denying that's it. That impacts on everything. That's scarcity mentality across the board.
Yeah.
But once you're out of poverty, you have to do huge increments in wealth to make small differences in happiness, the way I'm broadly construing it. Whereas if you reduce inner conflict, reduce cognitive dissonance, reduce anxiety, increase these meaningful connections, increase the sense that you're connected with reality in a fundamental way, that will contribute greatly.
So what you're saying, let me know if I'm going to stay back, let me know if I got it. So you're saying basically, I think this Daniel Kahneman did, in one of his book, he said after $72,000 a year, the incremental improvement in happiness are not that huge. That's right. There's not a big difference. But before that, there's a big difference.
Yeah, get out of poverty, and I mean out of poverty. I don't mean like just at the edge of poverty. I mean, again,
So that's one.
Yeah.
And the other one is I think this is what you're stating, is that the main purpose of life should be the pursuit of virtue, not the pursuit. Well, because people think they're going after financial resources and all these things, but they're really going after that because they want more peace or because they want more happiness. So it's kind of it's an interesting cycle that people are going through. So that's what you're saying. You're saying that the real goal is virtue. So that usually comes with financial resources. That makes sense in the financial world, and it happens to be right, and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And also the incremental improvements in happiness and meaning and overall life satisfaction are not really significant after a certain baseline amount.
Yeah, and so we have limited time on this planet, and limited abilities to affect our environment, and so you should spend, like I said, once you are stably out of scarcity, and we have to do a lot to help people with that, right? But once you're stably out of a scarcity mentality, a scarcity situation, I think you should try and spend the precious coin of your limited time and resources in the way that has the greatest chance of bringing you the kinds of goals or bringing you to the kinds of states that satisfy the goals that seem to be the most predictive of people saying, I'm leading a life that's really worth living.
And okay, so I love that. That's very interesting. And what about the mastery activity that I'm choosing? Do you have any sort of way of choosing that? Like, for example, that's probably not scientifically accurate at all, but there's this ikigai kind of like Venn diagrams of what you like, what you can do, whatever, right? Which is kind of a funny thing and kind of a gamey thing. But people look at those things and they're like, oh yeah, so I've done this, I've done that, I'm gonna try this. Because people are very confused. They go through high school and they like, I don't know what I'm gonna do, but let me just go through university. Then they finish university, I don't know what I'm gonna do, but let me just get this job.
Yeah.
So that happens, and then you're 45 and like, oh, I can't change now because I have family and everything else.
Sure.
So what would be your best advice, if any, to increase the chances of choosing an activity that you can master, which could have different financial rewards? That's fine.
Sure.
Based on what we talked about, that would increase the chances of having a good life.
Okay, so I have to be very cautious here. I don't like to talk about areas where I don't have relevant expertise. So I will only address. So I'm going to now admit up front that I think my answer is inadequate and incomplete. But so what I will talk about is where I think I have a relevant expertise to say something. I think that part, and again, this sounds trite, but let me try and make it a bit more profound. We need part of what a constitutive part of being wise, and it's I think it's implied in a lot of what we've been saying here, is to develop self-knowledge, right? And not just beliefs about yourself, skills that reveal who you are, perspectives who actualize your potential, transformations that reveal unknown or unsuspected potentialities and powers, right? There's a lot you have to do. And secondly, the kind of self-knowledge I'm talking about is not what we typically understand in our culture right now. We understand self-knowledge as, well, we get this from the Romantic tradition, a tradition that in some ways I'm very critical of, and I have a deep ambivalence towards, because there was good things and bad things. But to get back to it, the self-knowledge we often think we should be pursuing is getting my autobiography. And constantly revealing my autobiography to reveal what is unique and special about me, and to push my autobiography towards the goal of enhancing my uniqueness and my specialness.
Interesting.
And that's not the kind of self-knowledge I'm talking about. I'm not
So
even.
it's kind of it's made for social status in a way, where impressing other people, or some sort of combination of things.
There's that. There's the idea that I'm sort of born with a true self rather than I become a true self. Things like that. I think it overlaps with and can be exacerbated and can exacerbate a sort of a narcissistic drift in our culture, which I think is also part of the meaning crisis.
Yeah.
And so there's historical, social reasons. Now, the self-knowledge I'm talking about is not that.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the self-knowledge that's not like an autobiography. I mean, you may consult your autobiography in order to construct this, but I'm talking about the self-knowledge that would be more like the owner's manual of who you are. Trying to get a much clearer understanding of, the principles that are governing how you operate, and get much, much clearer about that. So I call this, because I think he's an exemplar of this, and other people do too, I call this Socratic self-knowledge as opposed to autobiographical self-knowledge. When you see Socrates engaged in this long project of self-knowledge, he doesn't really care about his autobiography. In fact, we learn precious little about it. He's much more interested in what are the driving forces? What are the governing principles? What are the patterns and processes that make me think and behave the way I do?
So it's basically a continual process of abstraction at deeper and deeper levels of truth, or something like that. Analysis,
investigation, but again, not just theorizing.
Yeah.
And the goal of all of this, again, and I think it's clear in Socrates' case, is not to reveal the uniqueness. It's to do the opposite, right? What's special. It's to instead become very, very clear. It's a kind of deep self-examination, and that the Stoics, I think, did a lot of work on this. It's to become very clear of the capacity, your proclivities, one's proclivities towards self-deception, self-destructive behavior, and also to see what kinds of things predict insight, what kind of things predict when I wake up, what kind of things predict when I am able to reframe a situation in a way that is more just to my interlocutor, things like that.
I was just, this has nothing to do with our conversation, but I was just reading this book by Julia Pearl. It's an Israeli professor, and they essentially, to my non-technical understanding, they found in machine learning the first time to draw causality.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is get big data sets of information and draw as many causational patterns that you can for your situations, and then draw even deeper and more everlasting algorithms for a life, or something like that.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. You can see that model in Plato. I would recommend, in conjunction with that, to do a lot of things to improve. I'll speak of two ways of how to improve getting better at finding causal patterns. Just getting better at finding causal patterns. And then you can turn that skill better on yourself. One, of course, is to become much more familiar with scientific practice. Not the conclusions of scientists.
The process, the scientific method.
The process, yes, the scientific methods. There's multiple ones for, they form a family. There isn't just sort of one thing, but I know what you mean, right? Getting very clear about how do we go about carefully trying to distinguish causation from correlation, right? How do we do that? Now, interestingly, and by explicit analogy to that, we can take a look at, and I talk about this elsewhere, we can take a look at the work of Hogarth, talking about, how we educate our implicit learning so that it picks up on causal patterns.
By osmosis and other things.
It's more like that. It's
I want to put that in your argument.
No. So this is something published last year in the Oxford Handbook of Spontaneous Thought with Leo Ferraro and Arian Hara-Bennett. The idea that part of what's going on in the flow state is, we can talk about the important insight aspects, we can talk about it more at length, but Hogarth argues that the problem with implicit learning is when your capacity to pick up on very complex patterns in the environment without explicitly trying to do so or being aware that you've done so.
By looking at how somebody speaks and you learn how to speak yourself.
Yeah, all kinds of patterns.
So not by having somebody tell you how to do it. Okay.
Right. So, and there's a lot of experimental work, and I talk about this on some talks. And the idea is, so implicit learning is the basis of most of your intuitive judgments.
Yeah.
The reason why they're intuitions is you don't know how you got them, and you don't know where they're coming from.
Yeah.
Right? But you have them nevertheless. And so, there's complex patterns to how I should be modulating my voice, my intonation, my cadence, my rhythm. And you're nodding. That's a very complex pattern. No, I never went to intonation, head nodding school. Nobody's ever explicitly talked to me about it. I don't ever remember explicitly thinking about it, right? But I've picked this all up. I have intuitive judgments. And a lot of your judgments, for that reason, are intuitive, right? Now, the thing about implicit learning is it's great at picking up on patterns. The problem is it doesn't distinguish well from correlational patterns. It doesn't pick up on causal patterns.
True or false.
Yeah, the causal patterns rather than correlational patterns. And so Hogarth says, well, what you should do is you can't replace implicit learning with explicit learning because that's to defeat its adaptivity. It's adaptive precisely because it's implicit.
Yeah.
It's not overwhelming working memory. So he says what you can explicitly do is set up the circumstances so that the environment in which you're doing the implicit
filters
learning,
those.
Right. And so what do? Well, he said you set up the environment so it's deeply analogous to a scientific experiment. You make sure that the place in which you're interacting with the environment, you're getting clear information, like in science, no confounded variables. Make sure there's tight feedback between what you do and how the environment responds. In an experiment, when I manipulate the independent variable, the dependent variable should closely, right?
Yeah.
Third, error matters. My experiment should be falsifiable. Error matters. If you put those things into the situation in which you're doing your implicit learning, you're much more likely to pick up on complex causal patterns rather than complex correlational patterns. Now, let me make one more point.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. What myself and then what Leo and Arian, we argued is those three information processing criteria, clarity, tightly coupled feedback, error matters, those are also the three characteristics that Csikszentmihalyi said you need to have in order to create the flow state. And so we argue that we think the flow state is an evolutionary marker for the brain, this seems to be the kinds of conditions in which I get very good implicit learning going on.
And flow, it has a lot of similar characteristics to meaningful experience as well. So they're all kind of aligned.
Well,
so
yeah.
Just one.
Yeah, no, make your point, please.
One point of that is, just to mention, so you can state this in your speech. Where can people technically go to learn these things better? Like, what are these books? Are these courses? Is there any specific video in your series that people can
Yeah,
take
I've talked about, there's stuff in the videos.
Okay, perfect.
There's published works. I want to point out one other thing. I want to pick up on the thing you said.
Yeah.
Because I think that's really important.
Yeah.
First of all, I think the other thing that's going on in flow that's also deeply adaptive is, when you have an insight, you've been framing the problem the wrong way and you go, aha! And you have that flash of salience. So there's a more complex argument, but just to put it very quickly, we also argue that we think not only is flow training good intuition, what it's doing is it's training you to get a cascade of insights. Aha, 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 aha. So we use the example of a rock climber. They get stuck, or they might get stuck, and they have to rapidly reframe. Oh, right, and then that's like an aha and another aha, and it's like because a lot of the features of flow are like you get this
They're
sense
upgoing feedback loops.
yeah,
they're reinforcing.
and you're getting this sense of a vividness, of supersalience, of at-one-ment, and as you said, there seems to be increasing. And so remember how I mentioned that insight is a sense of suddenly increasing coherence. So it's plausible. No direct evidence yet on this. I've got some close evidence that, if you want, I can talk about. So I'm making a plausibility argument that what's happening in flow, if it's an insight cascade, is it's really increasing your sense of coherence. I think that explains this massive sense of at-one-ment.
Would you say coherence is similar to alignment?
So
or
it's that increase in the intelligibility, the way in which you're making
so understanding.
Yeah, but not, again, I don't mean just intellectual understanding. I mean just engaged, And if that's increasing, and I think that's what's showing up in the at-one-ment, that, of course, is going to increase people's sense of meaning. This is why people do bizarre stuff like rock climbing.
Which makes no sense technically.
No sense, yeah.
And the downside is pretty high.
Yeah, it's not pleasurable, right? But there's been some studies showing this, that people do it because of flow state. Or think of the jazz musician, right? They're constantly improvising. It's a cascade of insights, right? The person sparring, right? And so there is research. There's quite a bit of research showing that the more you get into the flow state, sort of the more well-being you have, and it also seems to be that the more you get into the flow state, the more meaningful you find your life. Now, again, not direct research, but we have something overlapping with this that we did. We recently did a study, the Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Lab, in which we did a sort of a large MTurk study. I think we had
a large.
MTurk?
I don't know what that is.
Oh, so MTurk is a way of gathering data online. So instead of bringing people into the lab, they do
online.
Do everything online. And so what we did is we basically took some standard scales for mystical experiences and standard scales for meaning in life. This hadn't been done, believe it or not, and we tried to see if there's a relationship between how often you've had mystical experiences and how meaningful you find our life. And our basic idea was, well, mystical experiences are kind of like flow experiences. At-one-ment, you're getting a deep sense of understanding, right? And it's not just theoretical. In fact, often you can't even put it into words, but and what we found was two things. We found, now it's a correlational study, so I can't assert causation, but we found that there's a predictive relationship between having mystical experiences, how meaningful you find your life, and that a lot of the heavy lifting of the correlation is being carried by this sort of capacity of coherency, being able to make sense, that people are getting a sense of illumination. So
expansion.
Deep an expansion of intelligibility, that everything is one, think about what oneness means. The prototypical description of a mystical experience is oneness. Well, oneness is sort of maximal coherence, but not absurd coherence. It's maximal coherence, maximal intelligibility, maximal connectedness.
And do you think and we're gonna get to psychedelics, and I'm gonna ask you about that, because people are so I think at this moment, me as I work in marketing, so it's kind of, I look at patterns, and I do have some products and businesses, and there's this term of product market fit, in which your product and your features and what it does, it fits what the market needs at this time and space. What I think right now is going on is there's a message market fit with this meaning thing, because there's psychedelics, everybody's just talking about it, and people are not really that educated about it, but they know they should talk. There's this message market fit of all these things. So there's this big wave of I don't know why I said that, but there's this big wave of saying then psychedelics is one of the cool things that's
I think the psychedelic renaissance and the mindfulness revolution, we talked about sort of negative versions of the meaning crisis, addiction, people trying to escape from reality into video games. By the way, before I leave that, look at what people are finding in video games. They're finding all these structures.
It's a miniature version of life.
It's a miniature version of what's missing in our culture.
Short feedback loops, though.
So it's right. So you get flow induction, Video games are flow induction machines par excellence. You've got overarching narrative structures. You've got a deep sense of connectedness, right? You've got a normative order that makes like all.
But shorter.
Well, but are also artificial. Okay?
Yeah.
So I think all those are the negative ones. But I think there are, if you want to call them this, positive symptoms of the meaning crisis: the mindfulness revolution, the psychedelic renaissance, the emergence, like I say, of all these communities of practice.
Yeah.
And so I think the psychedelic renaissance is part and parcel of people's trying to respond to the meaning crisis, especially in two ways. Especially that it's both being taken up as an academic scientific study, and that people are more and more. I don't. It's hard to do research on this.
Yeah, obviously.
So I can't give a percentage, but I can say more and more people are trying to put the psychedelics into some kind of ritual context of transformation, as opposed to just taking the drug. So I think those are all, again, symptomatic fingers pointing towards the meaning crisis. We can talk about psychedelics if you want.
So let's, before we go there, because that's one of my last points to go to. So one, what I was about to say, I forgot. But just to finish the point with what you should choose in terms of activity and mastery and all these other things, do you think there's benefit in having a good indicator of going towards the things that you're naturally interested in? There's a lot of
Follow your bliss, James Campbell.
Yeah. Because I hear
Joseph Campbell.
We talked about this before we started the interview. I would just want your brief thought on it, and then we're gonna go to the next points. I think I heard, like, if I hear "follow your passion" one more time,
or follow your bliss,
I'm gonna I don't know. I'm gonna do something.
But see, that's
right?
that's
so generalistic, and it's just.
And it's also a feature of this decadent romantic background in our culture, that within us our heart knows what our destiny is.
We're flooded. It's like we couldn't know, right?
I don't think. I think that is. I think the evidence I've seen both scientifically and in people's lives is that that's disastrous advice to give people. That often leads people.
Well, it's confirmations because I like it, but I go on.
Well. Because again, why would unskilled, right? Why think that unskilled self-knowledge is good? Because you don't think unskilled any other kind of knowledge is good. Why would unskilled knowledge be good? Why would unskilled reasoning, like why think that you have within you some angelic faculty that needs no training or deep education in order to help enable you to make wise decisions in complex, ill-defined, messy situations, right? I don't think we should demonize or divinize any faculty. All of our faculties have strengths and weaknesses. My thinking can mislead me, my emotions can mislead me, but my thinking can also help me. My emotions can, it's too simplistic.
It's them working together that makes sense.
Yes, and learning that more difficult Socratic, Platonic, and I think this is also where it overlaps with Buddhism, right? Message, right? Of how do I understand them and coordinate them together so I get them optimally functioning, so that they reduce my self-deception, and so that I can more and more, have clearer discernment into myself and the external world. Yeah. And again, other than a romantic holdover, why believe that your untutored, uneducated, right, self-knowledge, sensibilities, biased process? Why think that is going to lead you?
Interesting.
And I just have enough examples, and again, not just.
And romantic is the way to put it. It's a romantic idea that people think that would be nice, so let's just do that. That would be nice.
Well,
right?
And also that somehow, if I'm true to myself,
there's so much going on there.
Yeah, somehow if I'm true to myself, which I think is confusing, like what virtue means about practicing integrity. Integrity is not the same thing as being true to yourself in the way the romantic, we're talking about it here. So somehow if I'm true to my heart, maybe I'll put it that way, then, I will just know what the right thing is to do.
So you're better off trying to pursue virtue to have less and less delusion in your thinking and perceptions, and that will lead you to better and better decisions. So the way, and we'll go to the next topic after this, but I think this is important, is make the best decisions you can with what you know and see and think now, and then evolve and make the goal to
this
improve that.
This is a classic Socratic argument.
Yeah.
Socrates would go into the market and say, why did you go to that doctor? Well, he did years of training. Well, why did you get that engineer to build the bridge? Well, he had years of training. Well, why are you then just trusting your heart for how best to live your life and deal with complicated, messy, situations with human beings that are extraordinarily complex and, it's no. I mean, I just, no. Does intuition play a role? I've talked about it. Yes, it does. But again, you should be working to educate your intuition as much as possible too.
And intuition is really the effect of our trained subconscious mind.
I would say it's the effect. I've argued with you today that argued in the positive sense of the word that it is the result of our implicit learning.
Okay, so it's not some sort of a genius that's sitting inside us. It still has to be trained. Just the training process is different compared to our conscious.
Okay, so
type of.
I think the psyche is self-organizing in important and complex ways, and that we can tap into that self-organization. I think that like all of our other things, we have a biological heritage that gives us some guidance. But again, to think that it is the master source of wisdom, again,
same that we have biases. They have been evolutionary ingrained in us, so this is the same. They're an evolutionary mismatch.
Exactly. One of my constant themes in the video series is the idea that the very processes that make us adaptive are exactly the same processes that make us susceptible to self-deception.
Really, a side point, it would be really interesting to see with the evolution of these technologies like genetics and all these other things, if those, because from my understanding, it seems like the feedback loops of our natural evolutionary systems are very wide, right? It takes 100,000 years to develop a new bias or something like that. When the advancements that we have in the environment is changing so fast. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to map out better algorithms to better adapt to the world, let's say, faster than we're naturally ingrained. It would be interesting to see if in the future we would have some technology that will allow us to do that. But I guess that we'll see.
Well, we've
close the gap.
Yeah, well, we've always been cyborgs. Other than our naked bodies in the atmosphere, everything else in here is technology.
Yeah.
Right? Everything else. We've been cyborgs for several species, and we have to remember that some of those technologies are not physical technologies. Some of them are coordinated set of techniques. Standardized, socially generated, standardized ways of doing information processing that we can internalize. They're designed to fit our cognition, internalize into our cognition, and we can apply them in a domain general manner. You're using one right now, alphabetic literacy. That is not natural to you. Yet it is designed. You didn't invent it. It's not a skill you've learned.
How old is this? 10,000 years? 20,000 years old?
Alphabetic literacy is from the Axial Revolution, from around 800 BCE. So it's not that old.
Evolutionary speaking, that's a blink.
So that it's not an evolutionary thing. That's what I mean. But think about how much you can use literacy in so many domains in your life, and it improves your performance. But it takes effort to learn this because it's not natural to. That's right. Same thing with narrative. We have to practice narrative. Same thing with mindfulness. Narrative is that perspectival, participatory. Mindfulness is procedural, perspectival. There's all different kinds of these things. So one of the things we have to pay attention to is get a clearer scientific understanding of these psychotechnologies so that we can improve how we reverse engineer them. Because we have improved. We went from hieroglyphic to alphabetic literacy. We can improve our psychotechnologies. Yeah. Right? And so that's another thing that we have to include in what we're talking about.
And would you say, and I have one more hypothesis, and we'll move to some next points. I learned a lot of these things that I was very fortunate. I had a pretty good, I would say a fairly good education. My parents taught me very well. And
it shows.
They didn't protect me too much. They left me, it was hindsight excellent. Then I didn't know, so I was like, oh yeah, fine,
Yeah.
whatever. But I learned one thing that I did is I learned a lot of things bottom up. Like I didn't look out, like you said, I've been taught to like, I need to figure it out myself, right?
Yeah.
So when I was 15, till 15 years old, I didn't really read any books at all, maybe 5 books in my entire life. And I had this idea of, I need to be fully autonomous and learn by myself. Now the benefit of that, there was a lot of downsides and we talked about that. The benefit of that is I learned this approach to like a bottom-up approach to figuring stuff out.
Yeah.
And one hypothesis I had, and this is the way I felt when I started one of my own projects, and I was put in front of all my insecurities and the things that were not enough about me, and I had to, because it's like you cannot enter the gates of heaven or something like that, not to go into Christianity, but like the analogy is good, and if you don't deserve it. So the action or the goal that I had was some sort of a judge that didn't let me pass if I was not enough to get it or something. So that taught me this bottom-up approach. And one feeling I had at all times was this idea of I'm removing friction from myself so I can go faster. Something like that.
Yeah,
so
you're returning that internal conflict like I was talking about. Yeah, go ahead.
So just to bring all the points that we made, not all of them, but to bring some of them home, it seems like all these practices, so we're born, we're educated, so we develop, we're cultured, let's say, or something along those lines. And then the pursuit of virtue and of all these things that we're doing with rituals and practices and trying to have better reasoning and rationality, they're kind of taking the weight that we had and leaving some of it off. One less pound here, less pound, so we can go even faster in our. That's kind of a natural state.
So you'd be happy to know that Plotinus has a very similar. Plotinus is the greatest of the Neoplatonic philosophers.
Okay.
He has a very similar analogy. He talks about like a block. We're carving a sculpture and we're carving off all the unnecessary bits until we can finally reveal.
But it seems like you're going in circles. It's not this. It's like seems like this.
A spiral?
Yeah. Going to center.
I think there's
But in any case, I don't want to go too much into that.
No, that's fine. And Jung talked about the sense of circumambulation. I think there's a sense walking around, going around. And Plato uses the same analogy when he talks about what's happening in a dialogue. People are often they're not wandering around, but they're walking around the topic, trying to get many different perspectives on it and get them integrated together in some fashion. And I think that is perhaps a better metaphor in some ways, as long as, you said, like I think the idea of a spiral is important because, like I said, as you start to, remember we talked about this, instead of reciprocal narrowing, you can spiral up.
Yes.
You can spiral up.
Okay. So I want to talk about the learning process. One more point before I do that. There's this, and I think we talked about this in some sort of ways. The biggest, not argument, it's not an argument, the biggest thing I've heard people say in their own progress, and a lot of people know this, the information is there, that's the internet. It made information widely available, anybody can access anything. So that's not the issue. People think information is the issue, it's not. You know what to do.
No, information.
Right, even what we're talking about, people can get to this information, maybe harder, but they can get to it. So what seems to be, the biggest argument I've seen is kind of a weird argument, is people expect to feel like doing the things that they should be doing or something like that. So what do you think, and we'll end this and we'll go to some other stuff, what do you think is the role of discipline? Kind of like in a faith way, discipline, right? Because you don't know, you're kind of putting...
at least faith in the older sense, the Hebrew sense of da'ath, sensing that you're sort of immersed in a course of action and you've got a sense of how that course of action is unfolding. So if you want to talk about faith in that sense, yes, I think very much so, which is not the same thing as believing there's sort of an external destiny written for you.
No, but like the role of pure discipline, because you're not enough, you have all these insecurities and all these biases, you cannot feel good about the things you cannot feel good about your meditation. You need to wake up and do it, just because, and put in the work, because you know that some wise other person said that that's the right thing to do, and you...
Right. So so this takes us back again to adaptive machinery.
Okay, perfect.
That can potentially be a source of self-deception. So here I point to the seminal work of Ainsley, but other people, on what's called hyperbolic discounting or temporal discounting. And the way this works is the following. Discounting means how much I reduce the salience of a stimulus.
Yeah.
Right? So when discounting goes up, that means the salience of a stimulus is going down. Okay? And if you look at the graph, so let's say here's the present moment and here's the future, discounting goes up hyperbolically.
Okay.
Like that. Which means a present stimulus is way more salient to me than a future stimulus. So one of my examples is, here's the chocolate cake that I shouldn't eat, but it's right in front of me, right here, right now, and right? And there's my health, abstract, long-term future goal. And so I tend to find it very difficult to not eat the cake, not smoke the cigarette, etc. Or procrastinate, or all kinds of things. Now, why do we have? What Ainsley found is that's massively adaptive. What's the evidence? It's across species, not even across human beings. Multiple species have this. What's it doing? Well, this is an argument that Leo Ferraro and I made. Right? We think that I think it's quite plausible. I think, in fact, it might be just be explicating the intuition that's in a lot of other people's work. So I don't want to take too much credit. But so you should. The should I'm meaning here is in the normativity of adaptivity. It's a very adaptive. Let me put it that way. It's very adaptive to calibrate how much attention you give something in terms of how probable it is it's going to occur. So if this event is very low in probability, I shouldn't give it very much attention. If this event is very high in probability, now is that an absolute algorithm? No. It's an adaptive
But it
theory.
has a pretty good accuracy to be...
Yeah, to be useful, to be adaptively useful. Now, right? So think about things happening right now have a high probability of happening. As I moved more and more into the future, right? So if you think about like the future opening, like here's an event and then it could lead to either one of those, and then they could lead to outcomes, and then, it branches out in this tree structure. And each one of the possible events in the future, its probability is, it's going down exponentially. So that's why we're screened off from things in the future. It's adaptive.
Yeah.
Here's the problem. And I will tie this into everything we've been talking about, I promise.
Yeah.
Here's the problem, okay? Let's say I don't. Let's say I'm the cigarette smoker, and I take a cigarette smoke, okay? And that leads to this chain event in which, like, I die in Hamilton of cancer in my left lung. Here's dying in Hamilton, right lung, Toronto left lung, Toronto right lung, Burlington emphysema. These are all different deaths.
Yes.
Each one of those deaths is a low probability event, right?
Yes.
But you know what they have in common? Premature death. So while each event has a low probability, what they share in common has a very high probability. And by blinding me to each event, the hyperbolic discounting blinds me to the
sum of them.
The abstract property that they share. Yes.
Interesting.
So what Ainsley said you need to do, and this is, I would speculate, I think it's a rational speculation, this is one reason why abstract rational abilities evolved. What you need to do is you need to abstract what they share in common and somehow represent it to yourself in a way that's salient to you.
I love that.
In order to try, he calls it symbolic bundling. And I think one of the things that rituals do is do symbolic bundling, creating narratives is a way of trying to do symbolic bundling.
Huh.
Let me give you an example. I'm trying to remember the name of the researcher.
It's fine. It's fine.
It starts with a B. Okay, so you'll be interested in this.
That's like 4 billion people.
Yeah. If I had,
You're fine. Go ahead.
So you, because this is a financial issue, and I know you're interested in that because you've brought it up a few times. So you go to academics and you give them all of the evidence. These are academics. These are educated, cream of the crop people in terms of supposed to be of their intellectual and reasoning, problem-solving abilities, right, and rationality. And you go in and you present them with just convincing evidence that they should start saving now for their retirement.
Okay.
And so here's the best evidence. Here's the purportedly most rational people. We should go back later and see that they've all started saving. None of them start saving. None of them start saving. It says, well, why? Well, why? Well, you have the hyperbolic discounting, right? Well, why don't they bundle with their future self? Why don't they do this symbolic bundling? Well, the problem with your future self is old, ugly, sick. You don't want to look at that very much. You don't want to identify. Remember that sense of participatory knowing? I don't want to identify with that future person.
So you're building walls around those images.
Right. So if I use an autobiographical narrative, I won't save. But what if I switch my narrative? Instead of an autobiographical narrative, instead of trying to identify with that future self, what if we go back in and do the experiment and say, hey, here's this future person. Think of this as an old person that you're responsible for. You have a moral responsibility to. They're old. They need your help. They need you to care about them and prepare for them. People start saving. Change the narrative. Change the way in which people are identifying. Go from an autobiographical identity to a moral compassion identity.
So not the manual idea, moral. Or are they the same?
Pardon me?
You said about you don't look at it as an autobiography, you look at it like kind of building a user's manual.
Well, yeah.
Is that similar to what you're saying with the moral side?
No, what I'm saying is the user's manual is what we're doing. We're paying attention to how different ways of responding to hyperbolic discounting, autobiographical narrative, how well does that work? It doesn't work that well in some situations. What works better in some situations? This moral narrative, this narrative of compassion. Then you will actually start.
And that's just one of the ways, right?
Yes.
There's all many others. Okay, so.
And one of the things that religions and wisdom traditions do is to expose us to these alternative narratives in symbolic bundling ritual situations in order to try and open up our understanding of the machinery so we gain the capacity that we might not have just by relying on our default machinery.
Oh man. Okay. So I have some ending points, maybe 3 or 4, and we'll end this. But it's been very, very interesting thing. So going to this idea, I'm really interested of what are your insights in this process of learning. Let's say, as a teacher, obviously that was probably, I'm assuming, really insightful, and I'm using that word purposely, in the way that people learn and everything else. Yeah. So let's start with this, with more of like your personal experience and your research point of view. After being a teacher for the time I've been a teacher for so long, what do you think? What is your understanding or your thought process about what is the best strategy that allows people to learn? Because it's not information transfer like people think of it. That couldn't be really farther from the truth.
I have a long answer to that
Okay.
because I'm devoting a lot of time to it. Look,
Yeah.
I think science is about how we get knowledge, right? Whereas education, pedagogy is how do you generate understanding of knowledge? And those aren't the same thing. And we shouldn't apply the methods by which we're generating knowledge to the methods by which
understand
we're
them.
generating understanding. Remember when you talked about earlier about all the information people have? There's a big difference between that information and finding the patterns of relevance between the pieces of information and relevance to you. That intelligibility we were talking about, that's a very different thing. And so I think that one of the things we need to put more scientific research into is, in order to enhance our pedagogy, is exactly how do people move through the stages of creating those patterns of intelligibility? What role, and so I'm interested in...
And what are those stages? So that's information, it's...
I don't know. I mean, I think...
Not the stages, the categories of, like the structural categories?
So the things I'm interested in, I just punned. I'm interested in the phenomena of interest. Why...
That's cool.
Yeah, why does something become interesting? And then about the something that, right, takes, like, how do you catch people's interest? And then what provokes... right? What provokes these two things, and in a balanced way? The two things are curiosity and wonder, because they're not the same. And curiosity tends to make you look for more information and explore something and zero in. Wonder makes you not so much look for more information, it makes you look for more kinds of information. It gets you to open up the types of information.
So it's wide versus depth?
I'll use a metaphor. Curiosity is sort of horizontal and wonder is more vertical. Wonder is about how does this all fit together, and right? And you want to get sort of to use Merleau-Ponty's term, you want an optimal grip between curiosity and wonder, right? Ponty had this idea that whenever we're trying to make sense of something in a perceptual way,
Yeah.
we're doing a trade-off relationship between getting the features and getting the overall. And so we move until we get, curvature, some of the features, and we get that optimal grip where we feel that we're sort of aptly set for interacting with the object.
Yes.
So what we want is what provokes interest, what provokes curiosity and wonder, but in a way in which, right, they're forming an optimal grip. The curiosity is getting people to explore the specialties and the details, and the wonder is getting them to explore the frameworks and the integration. And you want the best possible,
Mix.
balance between them, exactly. And then, what role does that optimal grip have in helping people tap into and integrate these four kinds of knowing, right? The propositional, the procedural, the perspectival, the participatory. And then overall, I think what they're trying to do is integrate their knowledge to give it as much plausibility as possible. They're trying to get connections that look like this, where a lot of information is relevant to X. X is then really fluent for me, and then X turns out to be irrelevant to a lot of things. And I want a lot of that fan in, fan out kind of plausibility structure.
That's so, I would have like 100 questions on that. So let me throw some things at you and you let me know if they make sense together. Because I've been looking, and there's this idea out there right now of the idea of mental models.
Yes. It's an old idea, actually.
Yeah.
Johnson Laird from the 80s, actually. Go ahead.
Yeah, so what I get from my, let's say, brief understanding of that is these are, I like the idea of algorithms because I understand it, but that may be a bad metaphor for it or analogy, but these are metaphors that are easily transferable to a lot of situations. They're just they're not very specific to the difference in their abstractions.
Yes.
So what do you think would be, because I'm trying to find some way to categorize all these things. There's data, information, knowledge, beliefs, wisdom, mental models. There's all these things. Is there any way to put them in some sort of hierarchy of levels, or that's like not a interesting? You talk about information and knowledge and wisdom as kind of like a ladder.
I talk about information, knowledge, and wisdom, and I also talk about intelligence, rationality, and wisdom, where wisdom is understood as sort of a rationally self-transcending form of rationality. So a wise person would have cultivated rational attention, rational perspective taking, rational inference, all these forms of rationality, and like we've talked about before, an optimal way of coordinating them together so that they're always improving, bootstrapping each other, always improving.
So it's the system that you're trying to work on. That's a reinforcing positive feedback loop.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, I think so. I tend to, instead of looking, I'm not criticizing your desire for a taxonomy. I think looking for taxonomies are good. I don't look for taxonomies because my orientation is I'm looking for developmental continuum. I'm looking for how do I start.
What is that developmental continuum?
Like we've talked about, starting with intelligence, how do I get to rationality? And then once I get rationality, how do I get to higher order rationality? Once I get to higher order.
So like in a stepping stone type of way.
Yeah, a way in which you've got earlier, and it's not a ladder. It's not like, I'm not saying that when you become rational, you lose your intelligence. It's just that intelligence is a necessary but not sufficient condition for rationality. How do I use my intelligence to make myself rational? Then, how do I use my rationality on my rationality to make myself wiser?
So it's like meta.
Yeah.
Wow, man. It's just incredible that I think this is, I just pointed out from what you were saying, like there's some very intelligent system that have got us to how we are right now, man. Like it's just whoa, like because we have all these things and emotions and instincts and rationale, and they've developed for the right reasons, so they're there, and man, it's incredible, highly interesting.
We have tremendous resources. So some people have objected, and I understand. I'm not trying to be obtuse or even argumentative in the pejorative sense of the word. They've said, why do you use the word crisis? Because it really sort of is alarming.
I think that's a good word.
Well, I mean, part of what they might be, they might be hearing it as defeatist or alarmist. What I would want to say is, I think there's increasing evidence, in terms of the interaction between the meaning crisis and loneliness, depression, which drives suicide, and then there's recent work from Tatiana Schnell saying that independent, a meaning crisis independent of causing depression can lead to suicide. And for increasingly young people, the suicide rate for children in the United States has doubled in the last 5 years or something like that.
That's social media, a lot of it. Well, not a lot of it, some of it.
Some of it, but also it goes back to Durkheim's original work on suicide, the book Suicide, where he argued the anomie, when there's a breakdown in the normative structure of the society, when it doesn't have a coherent worldview that helps people gather together psychotechnologies and practices and communities to deal with self-deception, to afford self-transcendence, and to cultivate meaning, then you get an increase in suicide independent of people's individual psychological reasons, which are there, of course, but there's this. So that's why I talk about meaning crisis. That's one reason I use it, because it's causing a lot of suffering and distress. Secondly, I think the meaning crisis is fogging our mind with respect to trying to address some of the other pertinent issues, ecological issues, socioeconomic issues that we're facing. So I think that's another reason for calling it a crisis. However, I will acknowledge that one of the downsides of the word crisis is it doesn't bring to the foreground the tremendous resources that we have at our disposal, like you've just mentioned, and the fact that there is out there a lot of bottom-up community work. People are putting time and
trying
talent,
to figure it out,
and not just talk. They're creating sets of practices. They're creating communities. They're creating discourse styles. There's all this stuff out there trying to respond. Now, here's the issue that we still face, and you mentioned this earlier: the bottom-up. Of course, there should be the bottom-up, always. When you're reading,
you don't have enough time for that in your lifetime.
Well,
so it doesn't make sense, really, to just do that.
No, and what I was going to say is, in addition to the bottom-up, you need the top-down. And the things that have provided us that top-down in the past, the things that gave us comprehensive, sets of practices and institutions and traditions for training and changing consciousness and cognition and character community. The thing in the past that could do that was religion.
Yeah.
And the thing is, for most of us, and I am not dissing religion here. If you've watched my series, I try to be tremendously respectful to it. But it's just a fact that the non-religious, post-religious is growing. And disenfranchisement from established religion is growing. That's just the case, right? And whether or not that's good or bad, that's
the data.
That's the data. Yeah.
That's the data.
That's not.
It's not an opinion. It's just the data. Yeah.
Yes. And so for many people, what that means, right, is religion is not a place they can turn to for that top-down guidance on how to, right, coordinate all that bottom-up stuff so they get out of an autodidactic fragmentary approach and get a viable, comprehensive transformation of consciousness and cognition and character and community. So they don't have that. We tried secular alternatives in the 20th century. We tried these overarching, pseudo-religious ideologies, and they drenched the world in blood. So people rightly are afraid of anything that looks vaguely totalitarian.
Thank God.
Yes. And so, but the thing is, we're trapped. We're trapped between, well, we can't go back to religion, and these political things, whoa, that's...
So what do we do?
Exactly. Exactly. So that's why I use the word crisis.
I think that's one of your carefulness in choosing the right words in your video series is more thought that people put in a book.
Well, I make mistakes. And we were talking about this actually before, and and sometimes I make mistakes because I try to rely as little as possible on, like, I have notes, but I try not to consult them
so you can let
so that I can get people enmeshed and I think immersed maybe is a better word. Enmeshed sounds like I'm trapping them. Immersed in the flow of a very complex argument, right? And so I try to.
So you have to risk that yourself in order to even allow them to be immersed with you.
So I'm taking great care. I am. I really want to assure my viewers that I do take great care. I take it very seriously. I try to admit when. Now, what I mean by a mistake is, I don't mean a theoretical debate. People are always going to
marginal mistakes.
People are always going to disagree with me, or they're going to say you interpreted something this way or that way. But I'm talking about no, I misquoted somebody, I mispronounced something's name, I got the wrong date.
Yeah, that's fine. Mm-hmm.
But the care matters, and I want. It's really important to me.
So, I think that's very important, because in a world in which the cost of output is almost zero with Twitter, social media, Instagram, Facebook, and all these things, and we were talking about this outside, there's so much opinionated thoughts out there that are generalistic, not useful, not applicable, not practical, that in a world where the cost of output is zero and the amplification of that output is significantly dangerous, so it amplifies, the positive goes to 100x and the negative goes to 100x. Everybody has.
It's biased more this way because people are biased towards
naturally towards negative. But in a world where that's the case, there's so much. I appreciate you taking the time and actually working on quality, even though you have the option to not worry about that, right?
Yes.
And put something out and 10 people don't like it, or 10 people like your post, and like, oh yeah, that's good. That's the reward that people have in their feedback loops. They post something or they do something, they didn't get the engagement that we're looking for, and that's why. And I work in marketing all these things to understand these things a little bit better. These algorithms are engineered for first order consequences, for engagement and keeping people on the platform, not truth. And that's really
salience rather than truth.
And that's I don't know if we were going to have time to talk about that, but that's a really complex issue, because if the thing that you're optimizing your feedback loops based off of are not in the platform, then how do you know? It's complicated. How do you optimize for truth? Well, it's complicated. So there's complicated issues, but I think that's why there's so much fake news. There's so much confusion, because the optimizations of the systems that we have, that by inherently they're amplifiers of whatever you are, be knowledgeable, unknowledgeable, whatever it is. Because you understand things. I just wanted to point this out for a minute. So excuse me for a long point. Because you understand this and you understand the danger of putting something out that amplifies negatively, I think that's a great thing. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. I mean, I want to be challenging to people. I want to be careful. I really don't want to build an audience. Is that the right way of putting it? I'm not even sure I like that, but I don't want. I don't want to
attract an audience.
I don't want to attract an audience on the basis of controversy, right? I want people.
If it's not the truth.
Right, and like I said, I there's no way I can get everybody to agree. So I'm trying to build an argument as carefully as I can. That's my response to that. I mean, the point you're making in general, I think, is a very important point. Chris and Philip and I talked about this in the book. Another, I think, important...
In your book?
Yeah, in the
So can you
book.
Mention briefly what the book is?
And Zombies in Western Culture, a 21st Century Crisis, because we argue...
so that's on Amazon and everywhere else. Okay.
And we argue that the zombie zeitgeist, the massive acceleration and pervasion of the zombie mythology is symptomatic of the meaning crisis. The zombie is a cultural expression of the meaning crisis. But we also then try to trace out the genealogy and some of the symptomology of the meaning crisis. Chris and I are working on the follow-up book right now.
Yeah.
It's Unsheltered, which will be a much more complex and comprehensive account of the genealogy of the meaning crisis. But the point I'm trying to make is that we talked a lot about a phenomenon that I think you're putting your finger on, and I'm using this term technically. I'm not trying to be vulgar. This is the rise in the sense of bullshit, and the fact that bullshit is pervasive.
And that's where then also nihilism comes out of, because you think there's
well, part of it is at least a cynicism, not in the ancient sense where the cynics are cultivating a Socratic way of life, but in the modern sense of there's no way of determining the truth. Nothing's trustworthy. Everything has a secret agenda. And why I bring this up is that following on Frankfurt, and I've sort of I think very closely on him, but I mean the idea that bullshit is different than lying. The liar cares about your concern for the truth. When I lie to you, I'm depending on your commitment to the truth to manipulate your behavior, because I try to convince you that something's true that's not.
Okay.
When I'm bullshitting you, I try to get you indifferent to whether or not it's true. I try to get you, like you were saying, I try to get you caught up in how salient or catchy.
So I don't believe in truth at all.
Or you're indifferent. You don't care about it. And remember, I mean, one of the things Socrates talked about is, what we care about. Caring about things in the right way is a deep part of what it is to be rational, right? And so we don't care about the truth in the right way. We don't care, and we get caught up in the salience of a stimulus, and that leads us in very, 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 very often deleterious fashion. Because the problem as bullshit increases is bullshit also, there's a feedback cycle. It's a very negative feedback, a very powerful positive feedback cycle with lots of negative consequences. And the positive feedback cycle is, as there's more bullshit, self-deception becomes more possible. Because the way I make this argument in many places, the metaphor we use for how we deceive ourselves, lying to ourselves, you can't really lie to yourself. That doesn't really make any sense.
For you is the truth.
Well, yeah, because you believe it, and also belief is not a voluntary action. You can't just believe. Like, choose a belief you'd like to have. Belief you'd like, do it. Believe it.
That'll be fairly easy, like writing an algorithm.
What? Well, the thing is, you generally just can't choose your beliefs.
Yeah.
But what you can do, so you can't really lie to yourself, but what you can do is you can use attention to manipulate what you find salient. So notice, if I say your right knee, it becomes salient to you all of a sudden.
Yeah.
It wasn't salient before. Directing your attention to something makes it salient. But also, when we find something salient, it catches our attention. So I can think about how social media will now spin this.
Yeah.
I use my attention to make that more salient, which means it more likely catches my attention, which makes it more salient, which is
more likely that other people are going to...
Yeah, and then I tunnel into this. And that's how I get led over into whatever crazy thing I get led into. So bullshitting enhances self-deception. But of course, the more prone you are to self-deception, the more likely you are going to start disconnecting what's salient from what's true, and you're going to feed back and fertilize the fields of bullshit, if you'll allow me to twist a metaphor.
Yeah, and where, and one observation here, I think.
Yeah.
So if you think of your beliefs like bricks on a house or something like that, that's at least how I think of it. Like you have these bricks on a house, and what you can do is kind of like take them and apply the scientific method and kind of like try to prove them all. And if you prove them, then you keep them there. Then now you take them out. But when you're in that position, in that feedback loop, and you kind of have all this bullshit, you don't really know which bricks are good, which bricks are bad. What do you do?
But not only do you not know, you don't care. It's both.
Okay, so what can be done, I guess, to start filter? Like what is something solid that you can put your hand on, that you can start doing the work to rebuilding your house, that's actually going to sustain the test of time, if that's a good analogy of it.
No, I think that's a great analogy. I mean, a lot of the stuff we were talking about earlier about all the cultivating. Look, I don't.
So it's what we talked about in the beginning with the. Okay, perfect.
And I want to make a point here because this is where I will challenge some people. I think the way rationality is being represented in the media in general, on YouTube and stuff, is an impoverished, truncated sense of rationality, where being rational and being logical are being equated. And I think that's a big mistake. I think logic is one tool among many. And then I want to come back if you'll give me a moment to criticize that notion of logicality. But I think logic is one tool amongst many to do what I think rationality is primarily about. Because you see this, for example, in mindfulness, right, and other things. Rationality is about a systematic and reliable set of techniques for overcoming self-deception.
Tools.
And the goal is self-deception, overcoming self-deception. The reason why so first, the mistake, if you just if you equate rational with logical, you're just talking about people's inferential propositional processing.
So only one tool.
Yeah, and you're forgetting all these other things we've been talking about.
So would you say it's I understand really well by analogy. So would you say if this is your house, if this is your room or house, you have tools that you use for either building up bricks, putting them together, taking them out, throwing them out. So it's something like you have.
So the Buddha, Siddhartha, gave a great example of this.
Okay.
He said, you want to be a goldsmith. You want to work with gold. Well, do you just hammer the gold? No. You just look at the gold? No. Do you just heat the gold? No. Sometimes you heat the gold a bit, you hammer it, you look at it, and you got to get these all balanced together to make the gold well wielded, so it's beautiful and is useful. And it's the same thing with rationality.
Yeah.
And the thing is also, you can't be comprehensively logical. The Mr. Spock idea is not doable for you, because if I were to try and logically assess all of the information available to me here, all the alternative pathways I could consider, all of the information, I can't do it.
And computers are much better at processing power in that kind of brute force way.
Even they use all kinds of things to truncate the search.
Yeah.
Right? Even they don't do, a comprehensive, you can't, right? And so you can't hold, and this is, I think this is part of where we've got to give a little bit up that we've inherited from Descartes. We can't have a universal standard of certainty achieved through logical validity. That's just not possible for us. So, but no, what am I not saying? I'm not giving in to romanticism. I'm not saying that logic is irrelevant to rationality.
It's just one of the tools.
Right, and I'm gonna play on the etymology of rationality: ratio, proportion, ration. Right. Part of what it means to be rational is knowing when, where, and to what degree to be logical.
It's the same as clothing. Like, you don't dress the same way in different situations. You adapt to the requirements of the black tie or shorts or nothing. It's interesting. One thing, and I want to ask you about the education system, and then I think we're good. Well, we could talk for a lot more, but one thing that I was thinking about yesterday, and I was watching some of your videos, is this idea of, I was thinking, why are these young people coming up with all these cool solutions to things that were obvious, but nobody really has done them before? Yeah. It doesn't seem, it's not complicated. Like, people are coming like, why did you do all those things? Just do this, right? They're coming with a fresh mind to things. Do you think it's possible? Because older people have more wisdom for sure. It's not direct correlated. You maybe don't, but there's a higher chance that you have more wisdom as you age. Do you, what do you think would be, if it's the same answer of what we talked about, just say that. But it seems like we need a new generation to come up with creatively new solutions, not just optimizations, but completely different systems and solutions. Do you think there's ways for people that have past that, or for us to keep in life systems or things like that we can constantly, not go back to childlike mind, because that's not probably what you should do, but what do you think? Do you think that's true? What do you think it should be done regards to that, so that people can keep their reinventing?
No, I agree. So I think what you're talking about, and this is a very important thing, is about cognitive flexibility. And generally, there's a way in which that can go down with time, and it might be, part of it might be biological, because fluid intelligence goes down. But there's things you can do also to enhance your cognitive flexibility. And so, whereas and you corrected yourself, and I would agree with your correction, it's not about trying to get back to childhood. It's about what can we do to enhance the cognitive flexibility we need, because it's exactly things that enhance cognitive flexibility that give you that ability for insight, to break out of, I can't see an alternative way, and oh, aha, right? It's the cognitive flexibility. So we can talk about sets of things, skills, again, that improve cognitive flexibility, and then improve insight. Obviously, things that will help induce the flow state are good for that. Again, going through ritual practices. We know that there's an important aspect of giving a sort of boost to cognitive flexibility. Again, this has to be said in a very well-chosen, rationally well-chosen context, but where you want to introduce disruption into. One of the things that will actually increase your capacity for having an insight is if I slightly distract you, I put some entropy into this thing. And you see this in machine learning.
What do you mean by put some entropy?
Okay,
into
so
this
let's say
thing?
you're trying to solve a problem, you can't solve it, and let's say it's on a computer screen. Stefan and Dixon did work with this. And then I put some static into it. I make the picture a little less blurry, a little less clear, a little more blurry, right? And that will actually help provoke an insight.
Because it's different, so you might try something different.
Well, not only that. Think about when I put entropy in the system. So let's say I'm misframing this problem, and I'm locked.
Yeah.
When I put entropy into the system, that can actually help me break that frame. So that I get I free up the components so that I can restructure my framing.
So you're back.
This is what's probably behind a lot of what people call incubation. There's work showing that it's not really like,
What do you mean by incubation?
So incubation is
like an incubation period to get insight?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Going back to Wallace in 26, right? That's how old that idea is. And the research is that incubation, it looks like it's more having to do with, getting moderately distracted from the problem, not sort of
like focused and diffused attention.
Just sort of, not completely. And it looks like evolution might have given us machinery for that. One of the functions, not claiming all by any means, one plausible function of mind wandering. You know how you're on a task and your mind goes away, is to give you that sort of moderate distraction so that you can come back and introduce some noise, some entropy, break up how you're framing your problem. So, and then of course something that we've touched upon before, you can move into ritual contexts, and also something that seems to increase, at least Carhart Harris and others are arguing, the sort of entropy disruption is psychedelics. And here's the thing, that lines up.
That's a very brutal frame breaking.
Well, it can be. But like if you take a look at machine learning, you often get like neural networks to do self-optimization by throwing noise into the system. Because if you let them just sort of settle on the data, they will overfit to the data. They'll get too locked, right? And they'll have a framing that doesn't generalize very well beyond the data because they don't have enough variation. So what you'll do, drop out, or you'll throw noise into it, and then the network can explore the state space more broadly and get to solutions and find detractors that it normally couldn't find. And so even in machine learning, we throw in disruption. Newberg's work on his book on enlightenment and Taylor's books on enlightenment, people do these disruptive strategies when they're trying to bring about these major transformations. If you look back at shamanic practices, you have sleep deprivation, and so you've got stuff like chanting and singing and acting that's probably inducing flow, but you also are doing all these huge disruptive things like sleep deprivation and being active for hours on end, and also in sometimes taking psychedelics because you're trying to bring about this huge disruptive change so you can get not just a reframing of this problem or a reframing of that problem, but find wait, there's something all these problems share. And I can get an insight into a whole system of problems.
So you're trying to break patterns that are, you're doing them in automatic ways or unconscious ways so that you now become conscious of them. And now you have new data into the system. Is something like that?
Not only new data.
Well, you now see them, right? Because when you're breaking patterns, when you're, for example, if you're not sleeping, now there's a lot of new data that's coming in that would not have came in before. And it's like, is that what breaking those patterns does? Like breaking frame, you're saying?
Yeah, so you're breaking frame in the sense that what you're doing is you're altering those lines of salience and relevance and obviousness that people are
that think are that's common sense or whatever.
Yeah, and then what you have to do is, so standard, you ask people, well, what is this? Oh, you're stroking. And what kind of tree grows from an acorn? An oak. Well, what's the gray stuff that comes off a fire? Oh, it's smoke. Well, what do you call the white of an egg? Oh, a yolk. No, you don't. It's the white of an egg. But people say yolk because they hear smoke and stroke and oak.
And there's a pattern
There's a pattern, and so go with the pattern. But you have to step back and break that and say, no, right? No, it's the white of an egg. It's not.
So because our brains are made inherently to save energy, they find all these ways to abstract things and not have to spend energy afterwards.
They pursue efficiency. But you know what you have to do? You have to introduce entropy so they also regain resiliency.
So what are some practical ways that people can do this? For example, let's say I have a job, or I have a business that I'm working on, or I'm a student. Maybe that's a bit different because it's just different types of activities. But what are some things that I could do, maybe on a daily basis, or weekly basis, or monthly basis, or even yearly basis, that I could do to break this? What are some actual practical things?
So there is increasing evidence that mindfulness enhances insight, enhances cognitive flexibility. Now, a lot of the mindfulness research isn't as rigorously structured as it should be. And I've published some work criticizing it, and the theoretical construct needs to be improved. Taking all of those legitimate criticisms in hand, I would still say we're getting an increase of evidence that mindfulness enhances cognitive flexibility in powerful ways, because it makes sense. I mean, so I'll use an analogy I use to talk about mindfulness. Like those patterns we were talking about, you said it, they're automatic. And I'm looking at the data through those patterns, right? It's like the way I'm looking through my glasses right now.
Yeah.
Sometimes you know what I need to do? I need to stop looking through my glasses, and I need to step back and look at them and realize, oh crap, there's stuff on my glasses that's distorting how I'm looking at things.
That's a really good analogy.
And then
wow.
but that's only half. You see, one skill, that's the breaking frame skill. Oh, I've got to, step back.
So looking at yourself.
Yeah, that's the meditative skill. But you know what I also need? I need to now put the glasses on and see anew, right? And that's a contemplative practice. So you need to do meditative practices, contemplative practices, different mindfulness practices in an ecology, cultivate more flow. You want to expose yourself, and I know this sounds ridiculous, but you want to expose yourself, like I said, to multiple perspectives and worldviews, so that you get much more flexible in how you adopt a perspective and move between worldviews. So there's lots of things you need to do. Doing this, getting into genuine, and I mean this in the good sense of the word, argumentation discussion, is also really important. There are communities of peoples out here who are trying to reorient us back to the process of dialogue, which can have argument in it, as opposed to the adversarial goal of me winning and you losing.
Yeah.
Right? And this is really important because, and I think this is an important thing that Stanovich said, the hallmark of rationality is, and here we're back to caring, the hallmark of rationality is caring about the process as much as you care about the product.
Okay.
How did I get to this conclusion? Not, that's the conclusion I want everybody to get to. Right?
Because if you don't have the process, you cannot get the outcome again.
You can't change how you get the outcome. Look, and if you don't care about the process of argumentation, you know what I can't use to change your beliefs? Argumentation.
Yeah. Okay. So it seems like, and I want to switch to the education system, and then I have two more questions, and we'll leave it at that for this conversation. It seems to me, and again, pure hypothesis, I have no idea if this is wrong, but it's the best I could come up with, is, so we have, let's say we are taught specific, in school and in life, we're taught specific tactics, like specific skills and things that we need to do. Like, take this chair, move it there, do this, do that, and now you're hired at IKEA. Like, that's the type of training we're getting.
Okay,
right?
That
Well, that was a simple thing, but there's specific things. What it seems to happen is, with the rise of technology and AI and all these crazy things, which are not as dangerous as people think, and they're not evolving as fast as people think, it seems like all these tactical all these tactical things, they're gonna get slowly outsourced, if that's the right word to use, because most of them are based on processing power of data input, all these things. Of course, there's high cognition things that need to happen. But what I was thinking is, okay, so let's say you're not left with that. Like you're not gonna filter your emails in the future. You're not gonna decide how you're gonna design your room. Like you're not gonna decide any of that. Somebody's gonna ask you 3 questions. Gonna say this is exactly what you want by implicitly what you like, not by you explicitly. So all these things. Okay, fine. Now, in that case, what would be a good way to have an education system? Because the education system right now, it's an evolutionary mismatch. It's been built to teach people specific skills, but those are changing so much, and people don't have the meta skill, if that's the right way to use it, to adapt and change. They don't have the meta skill to adapt to the environment. They just have to develop the skills to do something with the environment. But the environment is moving away at faster and faster pace. So that's the way the best way I could come up with. I think this is called metacognition, and all these things we're talking about, like reasoning capacity and all these things, they're metacognition.
There's metacognition.
What do you think about that, and what do you think about the education system that could go? What do you think about an evolved education system that could go alongside with this?
So I think there's a lot I have to say about that. I think first of all, stuff we should be putting emphasis on the education of wisdom. I mean, in the comprehensive way we've been talking about it here, and then in order to afford that, we need to put more work into frameworks that integrate information together, right? Rather than just doing what we're increasingly doing, which is fragmentation, right, and specialization. Again,
so structure.
Yes, we need specialization. I'm not a Luddite, right? But right, we do not put enough time in. I'm fortunate. I'm a cognitive scientist, right? And what we do is we try to integrate across disciplines: psychology, machine learning, right? Linguistics, neuroscience, philosophy, right? And so we need also integrative, and that would also be conducive. It's not the same thing as, but making sure that we complement specialized training with integrative training, right, would be something that would platform and would, I think, also facilitate the specific training of wisdom in our educational system. So I think we need more integration. We need more wisdom training. I think we need to.
So that's rather, sorry for interrupting, that's rather giving people the systems and the frameworks, not the actual information and knowledge, giving them the system that will allow them to develop more and to develop wisdom on top of that, right?
What you're ultimately going to do is, look, people are not, we are already losing in terms of memory accuracy, information
processing
power, right? You know where we're still way ahead of these machines, and it's at the core of insight, it's at the core of wisdom, is our ability to do relevance realization. Zero in on relevant information, make structures, break them when they're inappropriate, recraft them, you know.
AI cannot take a test. They can't, because that would mean they have that.
Well, and so some, you know, and Tim Lillicrap has done some recent work showing that even some of our best AI, and AI is making real progress, right? They still, you know, they can sort of do sort of standard parts of an IQ test, but that doesn't generalize in any way that indicates general intelligence.
Yeah.
And now, do I think that the researchers are going to continue to make progress on this? Yes. But where we still have a tremendous advantage and where we can still move ahead, and what will also, regardless of how we're doing with respect to the machines, directly impact backwards on the meaning of our life, is to cultivate wisdom, where wisdom means this reflectively rational enhancement of our ability to zero in on relevant information in an insightful manner.
And do you think there's a future in which, like, do you think this is an optimization of the current systems of education, or do you think this is a completely new system that we might not be able to put our hands on yet or finger yet?
I think that because of the urgency of the issues we're facing, I think because of the pressing nature of the meaning crisis, I think because of the real change, which is going to be analogous to the Industrial Revolution that artificial and general intelligence is going to bring, I think we have to consider much more significant revolutionary changes in the education system, precisely because the education system is now, I don't know, I'm not saying this is the way it should be, but it is, as a matter of fact, the primary place where we're making culture. The religious institutions and social organizations just do not bear that. People are sending an overwhelming message repeatedly that the political arena is no longer the place in which culture is being properly shaped. I think again that's sort of non-controversial. So we're going the wrong way. We need to teach kids more of the basics of reading and writing and arithmetic. No, what we need to do is to train them to make decisions well and teach them good learning how to learn, how to adapt and revise and transcend in your capacity as a problem solver. We need to make them more developmentally adaptive rather than thinking that the skills that were so valuable in the 19th century are somehow going to be the solution to what we're facing. Of course, we have to teach people to read. You understand? I'm not saying that. But saying that somehow the nostalgic return to the things I knew, like, come on. That is just not going
and proof for that, the biggest, most listened to course on Coursera, it's Learning How to Learn by a scientist. I don't know her name right now. Can't remember her, but that's the most popular course ever on Coursera. Learning how to learn.
And when you start talking to the executives in corporations, they tell you what they're looking for, right? And it's now, I think it now just moved recently to the number one thing that they're looking for, this capacity for insight and for learning to learn. That's the primary thing they're looking for in people,
which nobody's really teaching.
Well,
right? And there's still sorry if I interrupted. There's still so the education in a technical sense is, so it's knowledge transferring and information transfer. That's one thing. Then it's the social aspects of networking and social development, and that, I don't know what role that plays, but it's important, it seems like, and the cultural aspect of it. And then there's value signaling, which is the aspect of I went to Harvard, so therefore I must be smart, and therefore that incentivizes price increases with time, because if you're Harvard, you cannot take double the students, because that will mean the students that are inside have less value now, less value signaling. So there's, I think, the incentives in the current system, generally speaking, are misaligned with what would create the most meaning and economic value in the future, or something like that. And I was curious, what would be, so a goal would be to teach people learning how to learn, so the process that they would use in the future.
How to train in cognitive flexibility.
Got it.
How to cultivate rationality, how to cultivate wisdom.
Yeah.
How to cultivate flow. Like all these stuff we've been taking, and how to bring rationality not only to your propositional theorizing, but to your procedural acquisition of skills, to your perspectival ability to generate presence, to your participatory ability to generate affordance. How to get those as rationally self-transcending and adaptive as you possibly can.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, so thank you for that. I'm really passionate about this education problem, and I think we have till about 2045, maybe, like that's a singularity moment, Raker as well. If that prediction is accurate, then that, like, the gap, it's widening and widening and widening till 2045. Then there should be some sort of alignment, because general intelligence should be able to close the gap somehow. But till then, we need a lot of morals. Like, we need the right moral, ethical values. We need the right ways to think about meaning and all these things. Because if not, we're going to create a system that's gonna, that could destroy everything, basically.
I would like to make an additional argument. I agree with everything you said. And here's the additional argument. I gave a talk on this at the Center for Ethics at U of T. It's on YouTube if people want to watch it.
Yeah.
Look, and I've already given this, but Stanovich, we have overwhelming evidence that measures of general intelligence are only weakly predictive of measures of rationality.
So you don't IQ or general? Okay.
Yeah. And the best parts of IQ, the stuff that's loaded for what's called general intelligence, like Raven's progressive matrices and things like that. So the stuff that we're doing there, right? That intelligence so so how people do on IQ tasks, and then how they do on like some reasoning tasks, right? And so what you have is and this is what Stanovich is, so you have a strong positive manifold. How they do on any one of these IQ tasks is strongly predictive of how they're doing on the rest.
Yeah.
Spearman discovered that way back in the 20s.
Yeah.
And then Stanovich has found that, how you do on any one of these rationality tests, reasoning tests, is strongly predictive of how you do. So you got a strong positive manifold for rationality, strong positive manifold for general intelligence, and then you ask yourself, how much do they correlate? And if intelligence was the same thing as rationality, the correlation would be really high. It's about 0.3, which means it's necessary, but it's nowhere near sufficient. Now, why is that important for what we're talking about with artificial general intelligence? If you ramp up intelligence without ramping up rationality, what you're doing, well, remember what we've talked about. The very things that make you adaptive make you vulnerable to self-deception. You're gonna magnify these machines' ability to be adaptively intelligent, which means without giving them, if we don't have an explicitly well-developed, well-modeled account of rationality, and I would also say ultimately of wisdom, to give these machines, we're going to ramp up their capacity for self-deception too.
And right now, the way machine learning and deep learning works is you don't really know what they do. And that's it's almost by definition you don't know. You just know the outcome, and you're assuming how was the accuracy of the probability of the outcome. So it's already outside of our control. So if we don't set some boundaries around it, we're going to lose control, and that's just a matter of we don't know. We don't know.
I agree with you, and the strategies that are increasingly becoming important to getting successful, AI. The process, the system, as you mentioned, is highly complex and very self-organizing. It's hybrid. It has different things going on. All of these kinds of things, like I said, your viewers can look at that talk in more detail. All of those processes that are increasingly becoming the strategies that are being used to generate AI are the very same things that are sources of both adaptivity and self-deception in us. So we've got to not only make artificial intelligence, we need to make artificial rationality. We also need, I would say, ultimately to make artificial wisdom. Here's the problem. We have a lot of clear examples of what intelligence looks like that we can use. We basically measure these machines against us. That's how we do it.
Yeah.
Right? But if we don't have a lot of instances of wisdom and rationality, you know what we can't? We don't have anything to measure the machines against.
Interesting. Huh. So, yeah, I think it's a very interesting game that we're playing, and I'm not an expert by any means on this. So that we can finish off the conversation, I really appreciate your time. One unrelated question, sure. And then I would like to tell people how can they learn more about you. Obviously, we talked about your series quite a bit. I think you mentioned it 4 or 5 times in your book. But how can people learn about you? So the one unrelated question I thought this was kind of funny to ask is if you could talk to one person from history, recorded history, obviously. For sure. What would that person want? What would that one person be, and what would you talk about that person to that person about? And that could be either Buddha, Jesus, Hitler, Socrates, whatever you want, Plato. It could be whoever you want. Who that person would be, and what would be either one question or a topic that you would talk about.
Yeah, I mean that's hard. But if I had to choose the way you set the thing up, I think it would be Socrates, precisely because this project of self-knowledge that we've talked about and its relationship to self-transcendence, he seems to be a person that had a charismatic, magnetic ability to engender this in people. And so I would, and I just bought a recent book by Sarah Abu-Rappe. I only knew her by a previous, I guess she got married as R-A-P-P-E. She wrote an excellent book on Neoplatonism, just superlative. Excellent work on Plotinus, and now she's written what looks like an excellent book on Socrates, so I'm really looking forward to this. But what she emphasizes is the centrality of this Socratic self-knowledge and how sort of profound it was. And I've always thought that. I hope this isn't just confirmation bias. So I'm really intrigued by this argument, and I think I would not only want to hear what Socrates said, but I would like to open myself up to the impact of that magnetic, charismatic just tremendously skilled pedagogy and interaction and exemplification, and just feel the impact of that on me. I would like that.
One, so thank you for that. One thing that popped into my mind when you said that, maybe because AI can already do this. Like if you give it 100 hours of speech, they can they can. So maybe in the future, they would be able to create some augmented reality or virtual reality version of all these people that we could ask questions to. Well, that would be kind of weird, and of course unevolved, but that would be interesting for sure. So thank you so much for your time. Where can people learn more about you and what you do, and follow up?
So, like I said, I have a YouTube channel. They also you can go there, and I post a lot of the talks that I give at conferences. I would really ask them to check out the video series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis.
Great series.
Thank you. Check out the book, and there's so the book, the Zombies, a 21st Century Crisis, and I would ask people to look for the follow-up book, Unsheltered, that Chris and I are writing. I'm also currently writing a book with Daniel Gregg and Madeline Ibrahim. I get her name wrong all the time. I apologize, Madeline. We're writing a book called The Cognitive Continuum from Insight to Enlightenment. That's coming out soon. And of course, they're also welcome to just track down any papers I've written. So I think that'd be best overall.
Yeah. So thank you so much, John. Everybody, hope they enjoyed the talk, and that's it. They'll follow up. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.